At 49, former Navy SEAL Jack Mercer was down to $680, an aging Chevrolet Suburban, and Ranger, the 9-year-old German Shepherd who had stayed beside him through the collapse of his business and marriage. For weeks, they had slept wherever Jack could park without being told to leave. His last refuge was the neglected Lake Michigan cottage his late father had left him, a place Jack had avoided since the funeral. He went there expecting nothing more than a roof and a chance to start over. Instead, he found signs that someone had searched the cottage without stealing anything. Then a message hidden by his father pointed him toward the old boathouse. Inside, Ranger began scratching at a loose floorboard. What lay beneath it would force Jack to question everything he thought he knew about his family, and about the life he had lost. Before we continue, what city, state, or country are you watching from? Late November had turned Lake Michigan the color of hammered steel. Wind rolled off the water in long, bitter gusts, bending the bare trees around a faded cottage that Jack Mercer had spent 6 years trying not to remember. At 49, Jack had learned that a man could lose his life without losing his pulse. 18 months earlier, he had owned a small security company, rented a comfortable house outside Grand Rapids, and still believed discipline could solve almost anything. Before that came years in the Navy SEALs, where he had built his life around preparation, responsibility, and the quiet certainty that somebody beside him was depending on him to do his job. Civilian life had proved less orderly. 1 bad contract became 3. Debt followed, and by the time Jack admitted the company was dying, most of his savings had gone with it. His marriage ended soon afterward. The house disappeared next. Now everything he still owned fit inside an aging dark blue Chevrolet Suburban with rust beginning at round the wheel wells. His checking account held $680. For weeks he had slept in the back with Ranger, his 9-year-old German Shepherd, moving whenever a security guard or property owner decided they had been parked too long. Ranger never complained. He simply curled beside Jack each night, his black and tan coat rougher with age, and the first gray beginning around his muzzle, then lifted his head whenever Jack woke. There was something almost cruel about that loyalty. Jack had spent months watching pieces of his life leave one after another, yet the creature who had the easiest excuse to abandon him never had. The cottage was the last place Jack could go without asking anyone's permission. His father, Walter Mercer, had left it to him after his death, but Jack had never done anything with it. Selling would have meant dealing with memories he preferred boxed away. Returning had felt worse. Walter had been a broad-shouldered, stubborn man who believed silence was preferable to saying something he might regret. Unfortunately, his son had inherited the same talent. Their disagreements had begun quietly and hardened over time, especially after Jack left the Navy and built his company. Walter questioned decisions Jack considered none of his business. Jack interpreted concern as judgment. Phone calls became shorter, visits less frequent, until 6 years passed with almost nothing between them except birthdays, acknowledged by brief messages. Then Walter died, leaving Jack with a funeral full of things he had waited too long to say. Now Jack stood beside the Suburban, looking at peeling pale blue paint, a sagging porch, and a roof that appeared to have negotiated an uneasy truce with gravity. Ranger jumped down from the passenger side and sniffed the cold air. "Don't look at me like that," Jack muttered. "It's got walls." Ranger glanced toward the cottage, then back at him. Jack almost smiled. Mostly walls. It was the first joke he had made in days. The front door stuck before opening with a hard shove. Inside, the air smelled of dust, old wood, and a faint trace of the lake. Jack set his duffel near the entrance, while Ranger moved slowly from room to room, nose working along baseboards and furniture legs. Walter's old wool coat still hung beside the kitchen. A chipped coffee mug sat upside down near the sink. For a moment, Jack could almost hear his father complaining about heating bills, or telling him he had parked too close to the porch. He pushed the memory away and began checking the house. The habit came automatically. Windows, back door, electrical panel, water, fireplace. It wasn't paranoia. After years of assessing buildings for vulnerabilities, Jack simply noticed things. That was why the desk in the small sitting room bothered him immediately. One drawer stood open by less than an inch. Jack approached it and crouched. The wood around the lock carried fresh-looking splinters beneath an older layer of dust. Someone had forced it. He stopped and looked around again, this time differently. A cabinet door wasn't fully closed. Papers had been returned to a shelf in the wrong orientation. A framed photograph of Walter and Jack from years before lay face down behind a stack of magazines. Jack's exhaustion vanished beneath an old, familiar alertness. He checked every room again. Nothing obvious was missing. Walter's old television remained against the wall. A small jar containing loose cash still sat in the kitchen cupboard. There were tools in the utility room, an old hunting jacket in the closet, even a silver watch Jack remembered Walter wearing on Sundays, tucked inside a bedroom dresser. Whoever had entered the cottage hadn't behaved like a burglar. Ranger returned to the sitting room and stood beside Jack while he examined the damaged desk. "So what were you looking for?" Jack whispered, though he wasn't sure whether he meant the intruder or his father. He removed the drawers one at a time. The first two held receipts, pens, batteries, and the ordinary debris of an old man's life. Behind the bottom drawer, however, Jack noticed a narrow strip of paper wedged between the wooden backing and the frame. He worked it free. The handwriting stopped him before he read a word. Walter's blocky letters had barely changed since Jack was a boy. The message was short. "If you're reading this, check the boathouse, behind the workbench." Jack read it twice. There was no explanation, no greeting, not even his name. Typical Walter, he thought. 6 years of silence, and somehow the old man could still give instructions. Dusk had begun swallowing the shoreline when Jack stepped outside again. Ranger followed him down the narrow path towards the water, dead grass brushing his legs as the wind pushed harder off the lake. The boathouse stood apart from the cottage near the old dock. Weathered boards gray with age and one corner leaning slightly toward the water. Jack remembered summers there before the Navy, before the arguments, before every conversation with Walter had become a contest neither man knew how to stop. At the door, he halted. A heavy padlock hung from the latch, but the metal loop had been cut clean through. Jack touched the exposed edge. Whoever had done it had come prepared. He opened the door carefully. Ranger entered close beside his leg. Inside were old fishing rods, a rusted fuel can, cracked life jackets, and Walter's workbench beneath a narrow window. Jack moved directly toward it. Behind the bench, 2 screws on a wall panel were missing. He pulled the panel away and found a rectangular cavity cut into the framing. Empty. Dust outlined the shape of something that had once rested inside, roughly the size of a document box. Jack stared at the empty space. Someone had found Walter's hiding place before he had. The forced desk suddenly made sense. So did the cut lock. Someone hadn't wandered into this property looking for something to steal. They had been searching. Jack stood there longer than he intended, anger mixing with something colder. Who knew Walter had hidden something here? Why had his father left directions instead of simply telling him what the box contained? And if someone had already taken it, how had they known where to look? Behind him, Ranger began sniffing along the floor. Jack barely noticed until the dog passed the same section twice, then a third time. "Ranger." The shepherd ignored him, nose pressed near the rear leg of the workbench. He pawed once at an old floorboard. Jack watched. Ranger sniffed again and scratched harder. The board shifted. Jack crouched and ran his fingers along its edge. Unlike the boards around it, this one wasn't nailed down. He lifted it several inches and felt his heartbeat change. Beneath was darkness, but not empty darkness. His fingertips touched the edge of something wrapped and deliberately concealed below the floor. Whoever had broken into Walter's cottage had found the first hiding place. They had cut the boathouse lock. They had removed the box behind the workbench. But somehow they had missed this. If you're enjoying Jack and Ranger's story, tell us what you think they should do next in the comments, and subscribe to stay with their journey. Jack looked at Ranger, then back into the narrow space beneath the floor. His father had hidden more than one thing in the boathouse, and whatever waited below that board was the one secret someone had failed to find. Jack reached beneath the loose floorboard and pulled out a flat, waterproof pouch, its plastic stiff with cold and its edges sealed beneath layers of old tape. Ranger stood close enough that his shoulder touched Jack's arm. Inside were three things: a worn blue bookkeeping ledger, a black USB drive, and a photograph. Jack picked up the photograph first. Walter stood beside a man Jack recognized immediately: Martin Voss. Martin had been the accountant for Jack's security company during its final 4 years. A lean man in his mid-50s with carefully combed dark hair turning silver at the temples, a narrow angular face, and a trimmed gray beard that always seemed too precise for the rest of him. He dressed conservatively, spoke softly, and had possessed the irritating ability to make financial disasters sound like temporary inconveniences. Jack had trusted him partly because Martin never appeared frightened when numbers turned bad. Now Walter was standing beside him in a photograph Jack had never seen, outside what looked like the cottage, both men staring unsmiling at the camera. Jack opened the ledger. Walter's handwriting filled page after page beside dates, dollar amounts, company names, and abbreviated notes Jack couldn't immediately understand. Then he found something familiar: the name of his former security company. His stomach tightened. Several entries contained Martin's initials. Others referenced transfers and account numbers Jack didn't recognize. Jack looked again at the photograph. During the collapse of his business, Walter had repeatedly asked questions about the company's finances. Jack had dismissed them as another attempt by his father to interfere. But what if Walter had already known Martin? Worse, what if the two had been working together without Jack knowing? He slipped the USB into his pocket rather than opening it on the aging laptop inside the cottage. Years of security work had taught him not to connect an unknown drive to the only computer he owned. Ranger watched him from beside the workbench. "Looks like the old man had another life," Jack murmured. Yet even as he said it, the explanation felt too easy. A light appeared through the boathouse window. Jack immediately straightened. It moved slowly along the path from the cottage, then stopped outside. "Jack?" an elderly woman called. He recognized the voice only after opening the door. Eleanor Hayes stood beneath a knitted burgundy cap, holding a flashlight in one gloved hand. She was 71, short and slender, with pale, weathered skin, silver hair cut neatly at her jaw, and clear blue-gray eyes that made softness difficult to mistake for weakness. Jack remembered her as the neighbor who brought pies nobody had requested, and somehow knew every family argument around the lake without ever admitting to gossip. Widowhood had made her quieter, and caring for Walter during his final months had added a tired patience to her face. She looked at Jack for several seconds. "I saw your truck." "SUV. At my age, anything that large is a truck." Under different circumstances, Jack might have laughed. Her eyes moved past him toward the opened floorboard. So you found it. Jack's expression hardened. Eleanor immediately understood. Not what's inside, she said. Only that Walter was hiding something. Jack showed her the photograph. How well did my father know Martin Voss? Eleanor's face changed at the name. She stepped inside, shutting the door against the wind. Better question is why Walter wanted to know him. Jack waited. Eleanor explained that during Walter's final year, he had become suspicious about what happened to Jack's company. Walter never believed a business could lose so much value so quickly without somebody benefiting. He began collecting records, making calls, and eventually watching Martin's financial connections. He wasn't working with Martin, Eleanor said. He was looking into him. Jack glanced down at the ledger. A small knot of shame formed beneath his ribs. While Walter had been trying to understand what happened to his son, Jack had been refusing his calls because he didn't want another lecture. Why didn't he tell me? Jack asked. Eleanor studied him. Would you have listened? Jack had no answer. Then Eleanor told him something that changed the room again. Martin had returned to the cottage roughly 3 weeks after Walter's funeral. Jack looked up sharply. Eleanor had seen his car from her kitchen window and walked over because she thought there might be a problem. Martin claimed Jack had sent him to collect old financial records. I never sent him. I know that now, Eleanor replied. Martin stayed nearly 2 hours. When he emerged, he was angry, carrying nothing Eleanor could see. Jack pictured the forced desk drawer, the cut padlock, the empty cavity behind the workbench. Martin suddenly fit every piece too neatly, but Eleanor wasn't finished. He wasn't alone. Jack stared at her. A woman had remained in the passenger seat for most of the visit. Eleanor never spoke to her, but remembered shoulder-length auburn hair and a charcoal coat. When Martin returned to the car, the woman stepped outside briefly. Eleanor had seen her face clearly beneath the porch light. Jack already knew before he asked. Who was she? Eleanor hesitated. Claire. The name struck harder than Martin's. Claire Mercer, Jack's former wife, had been there while another man searched Walter's cottage. Jack remembered her as she had looked near the end of their marriage. 46, tall and slim, auburn hair usually tied loosely behind her head, fair skin scattered with faint freckles, and green eyes that had once been quick to laugh before years of arguments made them guarded. Claire had never been timid. She was practical, observant, and patient until she believed someone was refusing to hear her. Then patience became distance. Jack had spent months telling himself their marriage ended because the company failed. Standing in Walter's boathouse, he wondered whether the failure had only revealed cracks already there. You're certain? He asked. Eleanor nodded. I attended your wedding, Jack. I know your wife. Ex-wife. I know. Jack sealed the photograph and ledger back inside the pouch. On the walk toward the cottage, Ranger fell half a step behind. At first, Jack assumed the dog was tired, but then he noticed the slight unevenness in Ranger's rear stride. He stopped beneath the porch light and crouched. Come here, buddy. Ranger allowed Jack to run his hands carefully along his rear leg and paw. No cut, no swelling, no obvious injury. Just stiffness after hours on cold boards and frozen ground. Ranger looked up at him with complete trust, gray showing more clearly around his muzzle beneath the yellow porch light. 9 years. Jack knew the number, but somehow he had treated it as information rather than time. The company was gone. Claire was gone. Walter was gone. Ranger had remained through all of it, and now even he was moving toward something Jack could not negotiate with, outwork or defeat. Jack rested his forehead briefly against the shepherd's head. Behind them, the dark boathouse stood beside the lake, holding one empty hiding place and the evidence Walter had managed to protect. Ahead waited the blue ledger, the unopened USB, and one question Jack could no longer avoid. Why had Claire come here with Martin? Jack barely slept. By morning, the blue ledger lay open across Walter's kitchen table, but the numbers had stopped meaning anything. Claire's face kept replacing them. He had spent the night building the simplest explanation. Martin had manipulated the company's finances, Claire had helped him, and Walter had discovered enough to become suspicious. It was clean, ugly, and easy to believe. Jack had learned in the SEALs that the easiest explanation was often dangerous precisely because a tired mind wanted it to be true. Still, anger won. He drove south with Ranger stretched across the rear seat. The shepherd's stiffness improved after a night of rest, but still visible when he climbed out beside Jack 2 hours later. Claire now lived in a modest brick townhouse outside Grand Rapids. Jack had not been there since signing the final divorce papers. When she opened the door, surprise crossed her face, followed immediately by caution. Then Ranger stepped around Jack. His ears lifted. His tail began striking the porch rail. Claire's expression broke completely. "Oh, Ranger." The dog pushed against her legs, whining softly as she dropped to her knees and buried both hands in the thick fur around his neck. Jack watched in silence. Ranger had lived with both of them for 7 years. Apparently, divorce had been a human arrangement the dog had never agreed to. Claire stood again, one hand remaining on Ranger's shoulder. At 46, she was still tall and slender, with shoulder-length auburn hair, fair skin lightly freckled across the cheeks, and green eyes that seemed more tired than Jack remembered. She had once been quick to laugh, and quicker to challenge him, but the final years of their marriage had taught her a different habit. When she believed Jack had stopped listening, she stopped wasting words. "Why are you here?" she asked. Jack showed her the photograph of Walter and Martin. "Because you went to my father's cottage with him after the funeral." Claire's face tightened, but she didn't deny it. Jack pressed harder. "You sat outside while he searched the place. Is that what Eleanor told you?" The fact that Claire knew Eleanor's name sharpened his suspicion. "So it's true." Claire stepped aside. "Come in before you decide the rest of the story from the porch." Inside, Ranger moved through the familiar ritual of checking Claire's hands and following her into the living room. Jack remained standing. Claire looked at him and sighed. "You're doing exactly what you did when we were married. You've already decided what happened. Now you're here to collect evidence that agrees with you." Claire told him she had first noticed irregularities almost a year before Jack's company collapsed. She had handled household bills and occasionally helped organize company paperwork when Jack worked late. Certain transfers appeared repeatedly, routed through consulting vendors she had never heard Jack mention. She brought them to him twice. Jack remembered the conversations differently. Claire questioning expenses during the worst months of his life, Jack insisting Martin had everything under control. "I thought you were blaming me," he said. "I was warning you." When Jack refused to consider it, Claire contacted Walter. Walter listened. Together they began comparing old statements, vendor records, and information Walter obtained independently. Claire had not told Jack because by then almost every conversation involving money became a fight. After Walter died, Martin contacted her claiming Walter had discovered records proving someone inside the company had diverted funds. He said the documents might still be at the cottage, and convinced Claire that finding them could finally explain what destroyed Jack's business. She went with him. "I stayed in the car because Walter's house wasn't mine to search," she said. "When Martin came back furious and empty-handed, I knew I'd made a mistake trusting him." Jack wanted proof, and Claire seemed prepared for that. She called Rachel Bennett, the attorney handling Walter's estate. Rachel arrived 40 minutes later with Daniel Ross. Rachel was 52, medium height, with straight dark blonde hair cut just above her shoulders, a composed face, and the deliberate manner of someone who had spent 25 years watching families turn grief into legal warfare. Walter had hired her to organize his estate during his final months. Daniel, a forensic accountant in his early 40s, was lean and slightly stooped, with close-cropped black hair, rectangular glasses, and a narrow, clean-shaven face. He spoke little, studied documents before people, and had built his career tracing financial misconduct after his parents lost their small business to an embezzling partner when he was a teenager. Jack disliked how quickly the meeting made his private disaster feel like a case file. Daniel opened several records on his laptop. He explained that Claire had voluntarily provided her accounts during Walter's inquiry. No suspicious transfers entered them. No payments from Martin, no hidden deposits, no financial benefit connected to the transactions they had identified. "That doesn't prove every decision she made was good," Daniel said evenly. "It does mean I have found no evidence she profited from what happened to your company." Jack sat down for the first time. Ranger came over and rested his head against Jack's knee, then looked toward Claire. The gesture felt almost insulting in its simplicity. The dog trusted them both. Jack had spent years treating trust as though it required choosing sides. Rachel confirmed another detail. Walter had become increasingly concerned during the final months of his life, and had asked her to preserve copies of certain estate documents separately from the cottage. He never explained everything he suspected. "Your father was careful," Rachel said. "But toward the end he was also frightened." Jack looked up. Walter frightened was difficult to imagine. "Of Martin?" Rachel hesitated. "He never said." When Rachel and Daniel left, Claire disappeared upstairs and returned carrying a cream-colored envelope. Walter had mailed it to her shortly before his death, with instructions to keep it unopened unless Jack began investigating the company again. "I almost threw it away after the funeral," she admitted. "I was tired of secrets." Jack took the envelope. Ranger sat between them as if guarding the remains of a family neither human knew how to repair. Inside was a single folded sheet in Walter's handwriting. No account numbers, no names beyond Martin's, just one sentence. "Martin isn't the man Jack should be afraid of." Jack read it again. Claire watched him quietly, without satisfaction. The woman he had driven there ready to accuse had been trying to warn him long before his life collapsed. And if Walter believed Martin was not the real danger, then Jack had spent the last 24 hours staring at the wrong enemy. Daniel Ross called Jack the following afternoon and asked him to come to Rachel Bennett's office before returning to Lake Michigan. His voice carried none of the cautious uncertainty from the day before. By the time Jack arrived with Ranger, 3 monitors on Daniel's desk were filled with spreadsheets, corporate filings, and transfer records. Daniel had spent most of the night comparing Walter's blue ledger against old statements from Jack's security company. The pattern had finally emerged. Money had moved through several consulting firms, then into companies that appeared unrelated, but Daniel had traced the ownership layers far enough to find a common destination. Northline Holdings. Jack had never heard the name. "Martin handled the transfers," Daniel said, "but he wasn't the end point." Rachel slid a corporate filing across the desk. Jack read the name attached to an older controlling entity and felt something inside him go still. Thomas Mercer, his father's younger brother. Jack had not seen his uncle in almost 20 years. Thomas was 63 now, but Jack remembered him as a tall, narrow-shouldered man with dark hair, a long, angular face, deep-set gray eyes, and a habit of wearing expensive clothes without ever appearing comfortable in them. Unlike Walter, who confronted disagreement head-on, Thomas had always been measured and charming in public, the sort of man who remembered a waitress's name and could make strangers feel they had known him for years. Inside the family, however, he had been different. Proud, intensely competitive, and capable of holding a grievance long after everyone else believed the argument had ended. The brothers had once managed several pieces of Mercer family property together. Then came a bitter dispute Jack had never fully understood. He remembered shouting behind Walter's closed study door, Thomas leaving with bloodless lips and a face rigid with anger, and Walter later saying only, "Your uncle made his choice." After that, Thomas disappeared from family gatherings. Jack had assumed he moved west and built another life. Daniel's records suggested he had never moved as far from the Mercer family as anyone believed. "Northline received assets connected to your company's collapse," Daniel said. "Not directly. That's what Martin was useful for." Jack stared at his uncle's name. The warning in Walter's envelope suddenly carried a different weight. Martin wasn't the man Jack should be afraid of. By dusk, Jack and Ranger were back at the cottage. The wind had weakened, leaving the lake unnaturally calm beneath a low ceiling of gray cloud. Jack had barely shut the Suburban when Ranger stopped. The shepherd's ears rose and his body stiffened. The mild limp was still there, but the tired dog from the previous evening vanished behind an alertness Jack recognized instantly. Ranger stared toward the shoreline. "What is it?" Jack asked. Ranger moved forward, stopped, then pulled toward the boathouse. Jack followed without calling him back. Halfway down the path, he saw the door. It stood open in several inches. He knew he had closed it. Near the threshold, damp soil preserved fresh boot prints leading inside and back out again. Jack's old instincts urged him to move quickly. Experience told him the opposite. He checked the surrounding shoreline first, then entered with Ranger close beside him. No one remained inside. The wall panel behind the workbench had been disturbed again. Fishing gear had been shifted. A cabinet stood open. Someone had searched the boathouse after Jack left. Jack immediately checked the loose floorboard. The second hiding place was untouched. Whoever had returned either still did not know it existed or had been looking for something else. That disturbed him more than finding it empty would have. The first intruder had already taken Walter's box. Why come back? What could still be here that mattered enough to risk another search? Ranger sniffed along the workbench and doorway, but gave Jack nothing more useful than confirmation that someone unfamiliar had recently passed through. Jack photographed the footprints and disturbed objects rather than pretending he could identify a stranger from a boot tread. Then his phone rang. "Rachel." "I found something you need to know," she said. Jack looked around the ransacked boathouse. "That makes two of us." Rachel had been reviewing Walter's estate records after seeing Thomas's connection to Northline. The cottage, she discovered, was not as simple as the deed Jack had inherited suggested. The house and 42 acres of lakefront woodland around it had originated inside an old Mercer family trust, established decades earlier by Jack's grandparents. Later deeds referenced amendments to that trust, including one governing what could happen to the land if ownership within the family was disputed. "How much is 42 acres here worth?" Jack asked. Rachel paused. "Enough that I don't want to guess until I see an appraisal." More important was the missing document. Rachel possessed copies of the basic trust and several amendments, but the final referenced appendix was absent from Walter's estate file. Without it, she could not determine exactly what restrictions, rights, or conditions applied to the property. Jack asked where the original had last been recorded. Papers rustled on Rachel's end. "Walter left me an inventory before he died. He listed the original appendix as being stored separately." Jack already knew what she was going to say. "Where?" "A document box in the boathouse." Jack looked toward the rectangular cavity behind Walter's workbench. The empty space suddenly mattered more than every object still in the building. The break-in at the cottage, Martin's visit, Thomas hiding behind Northline, and the missing box were no longer separate problems. Someone had removed the one document that might explain why 42 acres of Mercer land mattered enough to conceal ownership behind layers of companies. Ranger stood beside the open doorway, watching the dark shoreline, while Jack felt the story of his ruined business begin to merge with a family feud that had started long before his company even existed. The blue ledger had shown him where his money went. The empty hiding place now suggested what someone might have been trying to control. And for the first time, Jack wondered whether destroying his company had ever been the real objective at all. The 42 acres did not make Jack rich. By Monday afternoon, Rachel had gathered enough zoning and land use records to destroy that possibility. Much of the Mercer property consisted of protected shoreline, wet ground, and wooded acreage restricted by conservation rules written into earlier agreements. There was value there, certainly, but not the instant fortune Jack had briefly imagined Thomas might be trying to steal. Selling or developing large portions of it would be difficult, perhaps impossible, without resolving the missing trust appendix. Jack felt strangely embarrassed by his own assumption. He had spent years watching money disappear, and had begun seeing money behind every motive. Daniel continued tracing Northline, but tracing shell companies did not put groceries in Jack's refrigerator. His account balance kept shrinking. So Jack returned to what he knew. He accepted small security jobs around nearby towns, checking alarm systems at a pharmacy, reviewing camera placement for a marina, and spending one cold evening assessing the locks at a family-owned hardware store. The work paid little, but each invoice carried his own name again. That mattered more than he expected. The cottage changed slowly with him. Jack patched a leak above the kitchen, replaced 2 rotten porch boards, cleaned the chimney, and discovered that Walter had apparently believed every broken object deserved at least 4 opportunities before being thrown away. Ranger followed him through most of it, sometimes carrying a rag or glove away as if contributing to the project. But the shepherd's limp no longer disappeared completely after rest. Jack took him to a local veterinarian who found no acute injury but confirmed what Jack had been trying not to name. Ranger's rear leg showed age-related stiffness that would need monitoring, reduced strain, and regular care. The appointment, medication, and follow-up cost money Jack could barely spare. He paid anyway. That evening he sat on the cottage floor beside Ranger, slowly rubbing the dog's shoulder while calculating what remained in his account. "You kept me alive when I couldn't afford much," he murmured. "I think I can afford you." Ranger rested his gray muzzle across Jack's thigh. Jack smiled, but the arithmetic frightened him. For the first time, the investigation was competing with ordinary survival. 3 nights later, Jack returned from a security job after dark. Ranger climbed carefully from the Suburban, then suddenly froze. His head turned toward the lake. A second later, he moved fast enough that Jack called after him. The boathouse door stood open. Ranger reached it first, barking once into the darkness before stopping at the threshold. Jack approached more carefully, flashlight in hand. Nothing moved inside. The loose floorboard remained undisturbed. The empty cavity behind the workbench was unchanged, but something new sat in plain sight beneath the window. A cream-colored envelope positioned precisely in the center of Walter's workbench. That frightened Jack more than another ransacking would have. Whoever had entered wanted him to find this. There was no name on the envelope. Inside was a photocopy of an old bank check dated shortly before Jack founded his security company. The amount made him sit down, $84,500. Thomas Mercer's signature appeared on the lower right. Walter Mercer was listed as the recipient. Jack stared at the date. His first office lease, equipment purchases, insurance, and initial payroll had been financed by what Walter told him was family money he had saved and invested over the years. Jack had eventually repaid much of it, though Walter had refused interest. The amount on this check was only a few $1,000s away from the capital Walter had given him. Jack's first thought was impossible. His second was worse. Had Walter lied about where the money came from? Had Thomas financed Jack's company through Walter? If so, why? Jack turned the photocopy over. Blank. No explanation, no threat, no demand. Just enough information to make him distrust a dead man who could no longer defend himself. His phone rang before he reached the cottage. The number was unfamiliar. Jack answered without speaking. "You found the envelope." Martin Voss sounded exactly as Jack remembered. Calm, measured, almost courteous. Jack stopped walking. Ranger remained beside him, watching the darkness behind them. "Were you in my boathouse?" Jack asked. Martin ignored the question. "This has gone far enough." Jack felt anger rise, but he kept his voice flat. "Then explain it." Martin exhaled softly. "I can offer you $150,000. Legitimately transferred, documented, taxes handled. You stop asking Daniel Ross to follow Northline. You stop digging through Walter's records. You keep the cottage and whatever peace you can still make there." Jack almost laughed. 2 months earlier, $150,000 would have seemed like rescue. Even now he could see what it could buy. Ranger's care without counting dollars, repairs to the cottage, a reliable vehicle, time to rebuild his business. Martin seemed to understand the silence. "You don't have to lose everything twice, Jack." Jack looked down at Ranger. The shepherd's hind leg trembled faintly from the run to the boathouse. $150,000 could solve problems Jack could touch. The truth might solve none of them. That was what made the offer dangerous. "Why pay me that much to stop if there's nothing worth finding?" Jack asked. Martin was silent for several seconds. "Because some answers cost more than they're worth. Not good enough." Jack heard the old certainty return to his own voice. "Keep your money." Martin did not argue. His response came quietly. "Then ask your father where your first dollar came from." The line went dead. Jack remained beside the lake with the photocopied check in one hand, and Ranger pressed against his leg. Walter had helped him build the company Jack later lost. Thomas had apparently supplied money Walter claimed as his own. Martin was willing to pay $150,000 to keep Jack from understanding why. Jack had begun this investigation believing someone had stolen his business from him. Now a more painful possibility had opened beneath his feet. Perhaps the mystery had begun before the company even existed. Jack did not touch the USB for nearly a day. Martin's words had made the small black drive feel heavier than it was. By evening, Daniel had arranged for its contents to be opened safely on an isolated computer, and Jack sat at Walter's kitchen table while Ranger slept near the fireplace. Most of the files were scans: old statements, company records, letters between Walter and Thomas, and documents reaching back decades. Then Jack found several video files recorded during Walter's final months. In the first, his father sat in the same kitchen, thinner than Jack remembered, his broad frame reduced by illness, white hair combed back from a deeply lined face. Walter looked directly into the camera. "If Jack is watching this," he began, "then I waited too long again." Jack nearly closed the file. Instead, he kept watching. Walter explained that he and Thomas had once jointly owned Mercer Marine Supply, a modest family business serving marinas along the Michigan shoreline. Thomas handled expansion and financing. Walter managed operations. For years, they prospered. Then Walter discovered Thomas had been quietly moving company money through accounts Walter had never authorized. What followed was not the story Jack expected. Walter confronted Thomas but refused to involve police, partly to protect the Mercer name and partly because exposing the fraud would have endangered employees and contracts. Instead, Walter accessed one of the accounts Thomas had used and recovered money he believed belonged to the company. By Walter's own admission, that was where he crossed his own line. Rather than restore every dollar through formal company accounting, he kept part of the recovered money outside the books. Years later, when Jack left the Navy and wanted to start his security company, Walter used $84,500 of it to help him. "I told myself I was taking back what Thomas stole," Walter said on the screen. "Then I told myself helping my son made it clean." Neither was true. Jack leaned away from the computer. The money that had allowed him to sign his first lease, hire his first employees, and call himself independent had never been what Walter claimed. His father had built Jack's beginning on a secret, and then allowed him to spend years believing it was an uncomplicated gift. The later files completed the uglier half. Thomas eventually learned what Walter had done. By then, the brothers' business relationship was destroyed, and Thomas had come to view the recovered money not as company property, but as something Walter had personally stolen from him. Years passed, but the grievance hardened instead of fading. Through Northline Holdings, Thomas later used Martin to position himself around Jack's company. Martin exploited weak controls, layered transactions through consulting vendors, and took advantage of financial documents Jack had signed during desperate months without reading closely enough. Daniel had already warned Jack that some signatures appeared genuine. Now Jack understood why. Thomas had not simply attacked the company for profit. He had been reclaiming, with interest, what he believed Walter had taken from him. None of that made the transfers lawful. None of it made Martin innocent. But it destroyed the clean version Jack wanted. Thomas the thief, Walter the protector, Jack the victim. Thomas had committed wrongdoing. Martin had helped him. Walter had concealed his own misconduct, and Jack himself had been careless when fear and pride made him hand control of important decisions to other people. Jack shoved back from the table so hard the chair struck the wall. "Enough!" Ranger raised his head. Jack paced into the sitting room, anger searching for somewhere to land. For days he had imagined uncovering the truth would restore order. Instead, every answer contaminated something else. Walter had investigated Martin, yes, but partly because he knew the history Martin's records might expose. Jack looked at the cottage around him and suddenly hated the secrets built into it. Notes behind drawers, boxes behind walls, records beneath floors. "He could have told me," Jack said. Ranger watched him. "Any of them could have told me." But beneath that anger sat another thought Jack wanted even less. Claire had tried. Walter had tried. Badly and too late. Jack had spent years treating questions as attacks because admitting uncertainty felt too much like weakness. He reached for his coat. He did not know where he intended to go. He only knew he wanted out. Ranger rose slowly. Instead of following Jack to the door, he disappeared down the hallway. A minute later he returned carrying something gently between his teeth. An old leather work glove. Jack recognized it immediately. Walter used to wear those gloves while repairing the dock, and Ranger had apparently found one somewhere in the house. The shepherd crossed the room with his uneven gait and dropped it at Jack's feet. There was nothing mystical about it. Ranger did not understand Walter's confession or family betrayal. He had found an object carrying an old familiar scent and brought it to the man he trusted. Yet Jack stood staring at that worn glove as if 6 years of silence had suddenly acquired weight. Ranger had never required people to be innocent before remembering them. Jack slowly removed his coat. "All right," he whispered. we finish it. He returned to the kitchen and opened Walter's final recording. His father looked exhausted. I'm not asking you to forgive me, Jack. I don't get to ask that. I'm asking you to find the truth before somebody turns my mistakes into your inheritance. Walter explained that the dispute had eventually expanded beyond money to the old Mercer family trust, but he did not know whether the final amendment still existed. He believed Thomas wanted control of the lake property, because losing it would mean losing the last argument between them. Walter's final words were simpler. Don't spend your life proving I was right. I wasn't. Find out what is. The screen went dark. Jack was still sitting there when Rachel called. Her voice was unusually urgent. A retired records clerk helping search archived trust filings had located a certified copy of the missing amendment in an older county file. Rachel had reviewed it twice. Neither Walter nor Thomas had possessed the right to treat the 42 acres as personal property indefinitely. The amendment required that when the surviving generation's control ended or the specified conditions were triggered, the land had to be preserved for a community-serving purpose under the trust. Jack looked toward the dark lake beyond the kitchen window. For days, everyone had behaved as if the land were a prize. It wasn't. Walter could not ultimately give it to Jack as his private kingdom. Thomas could not rightfully take it for himself. The property at the center of their feud had never truly belonged to either brother in the way both men had believed. 11 months later, the cottage no longer looked like a place a desperate man had entered because he had nowhere else to sleep. The porch stood level, the roof no longer leaked, and spring sunlight stretched across Lake Michigan in long silver bands. Jack Mercer had changed more slowly. The investigation had taken months of interviews, subpoenas, financial reconstruction, and conversations he would once have avoided. Daniel's analysis eventually confirmed an uncomfortable truth. Jack really had signed several documents during the collapse of his company without reading them carefully. Fear, exhaustion, and misplaced trust had made him careless. But other documents carrying his name were not his work. Signatures had been reproduced, authorizations altered, and transactions concealed through entities connected to Northline. Martin Voss eventually cooperated with investigators, providing records that strengthened the case against Thomas Mercer in exchange for consideration of his own cooperation. Thomas now faced serious legal and financial consequences. Some transactions were reversed, and Jack recovered part of what he had lost. Not everything. Enough. Rachel explained that Jack could continue challenging several issues surrounding the Mercer family trust. There were arguments available, filings that could be made, and perhaps additional control he might obtain if he was willing to spend another year or two fighting. 11 months earlier, Jack would have heard only the word control. Now he heard year or two. He looked down at Ranger, lying beneath Rachel's conference table with his silvering muzzle resting between his paws. The German Shepherd was 10 now. His rear legs had grown stiffer despite regular veterinary care, and long walks had become shorter ones taken at Ranger's pace rather than Jack's. Time had become something Jack could finally see. Walter and Thomas had spent decades keeping score until neither man could remember what winning was supposed to look like. Jack had already lost 6 years with his father doing much the same thing in another form. No, he told Rachel. Resolve what has to be resolved. I'm done fighting for more. Rachel studied him for a moment, then nodded. Walter would probably argue with that decision. Jack smiled faintly. That's one reason I like it. The trust amendment gave him a direction instead of another battlefield. With Rachel handling the legal structure and recovered funds covering the first repairs, Jack kept the cottage as his home, while placing the usable portion of the surrounding property into the community-serving framework required by the trust. He did not build anything grand. There were no luxury cabins, ceremonial gates, or polished monuments to the Mercer name. Instead, an existing storage building became a modest workshop and training room. 2 small structures were renovated for temporary stays. Jack began working with local veteran organizations to create a place where former service members struggling with the transition into civilian life could learn practical security skills, prepare for interviews, work on resumes, or simply spend a few days somewhere quiet enough to think. Another section supported older rescue dogs that were often passed over for adoption. Jack understood both populations better than he would have admitted a year earlier. Creatures trained for one kind of life who suddenly had to discover what they were when that life ended. Claire visited twice during the summer. The first time, conversation remained careful. The second time, Ranger abandoned Jack halfway across the yard to greet her, tail sweeping happily through the grass. Jack no longer felt betrayed by the sight. He and Claire did not pretend their marriage could be restored, simply because the truth about Martin had changed part of their past. Too much had happened, and not all of it belonged to Thomas or Walter. Jack apologized for the warnings he had refused to hear. Claire apologized for the secrets she had helped keep. It was not reconciliation in the romantic sense. It was something quieter and perhaps more difficult. 2 people allowing the past to become accurate without demanding that it become reversible. Eleanor remained nearby, appearing whenever she believed Jack was doing something incorrectly, and occasionally when he was not. Daniel helped establish basic financial controls for the new program, joking that Jack was no longer allowed to sign anything longer than 1 page without calling someone first. Jack did not argue. By early autumn, only the boathouse remained unfinished. Jack had delayed repairing it without admitting why. Too much had begun there. The missing box, the blue ledger, the first proof that Walter had left behind more questions than answers. One clear afternoon, Jack finally carried his tools down to the shoreline. Ranger followed slowly, pausing halfway before continuing. "You could stay at the house," Jack told him. Ranger ignored the suggestion with the practiced contempt of an old partner. Together they spent hours replacing warped boards and reinforcing the workbench. Near sunset, Jack was gathering screws when he heard scratching behind him. He turned. Ranger had his nose beneath the workbench and was pawing at the floor. Jack stared at him. "Absolutely not." Ranger scratched again. Jack began laughing, a genuine laugh that startled a pair of birds from the dock. "We are done finding things." Ranger looked at him and pawed once more. Jack surrendered. Beneath a narrow strip of loose wood was a shallow space Jack had somehow missed. There was no ledger, no USB, no trust document. Only an old photograph sealed inside a plastic sleeve. Jack pulled it free. He was perhaps 17 in the picture, standing beside Walter on the dock with a fish. Neither of them looked particularly proud of catching. Walter's hand rested awkwardly on his son's shoulder. Jack turned the photograph over. His father's handwriting filled one line. "Maybe you finally learned where to stop looking." Jack sat back against the workbench. He had no idea when Walter had written it, or whether his father could possibly have known how perfectly those words would arrive. For once, Jack decided the unanswered part did not need solving. Ranger lowered himself into a patch of late afternoon sunlight near the open door, gray muzzle on his paws, watching the lake. Jack had not recovered everything. His company was gone. His marriage remained over. 6 lost years with Walter could never be returned, and Ranger would never become young again. 11 months earlier, Jack would have measured all of that as failure. Now he looked toward the cottage, the repaired buildings beyond it, and the old dog who had walked beside him when he owned almost nothing. His old life wasn't waiting to be recovered. That was the point. Jack placed the photograph carefully in his jacket, sat beside Ranger, and watched the light move across Lake Michigan. For the first time in years, there was nothing left he needed to chase. Sometimes the hardest truth is not discovering who betrayed us, but realizing that the people we loved were imperfect, and that we were imperfect too. Jack lost his business, his marriage, his security, and the future he once believed was guaranteed. Yet, beside Ranger, he discovered that dignity does not come from recovering everything that was taken. It comes from choosing what is still worth carrying forward. Truth gave Jack answers, but loyalty gave him strength, and forgiveness finally gave him somewhere to stop. Perhaps our second chances begin the same way, not by rebuilding the life we lost exactly as it was, but by creating something better from what remains. If this story might give someone you know a little hope to begin again, consider sharing it with them. Thank you for staying with Jack and Ranger until the end. Sometimes what remains is enough to begin again.